Hello, this is Lee Clegg, President of Africa Business Portal, and we are thrilled to welcome you to this webinar today, Smart Agriculture, African Agriculture in the 21st Century. I'd like to take time today to introduce our panelists today. I'll let them take a minute and tell us a little bit about themselves. We have Patricia Sheikh, who's the Agribusiness Director for the Corporate Council on Africa, and Bruce D. Cameron, who's Director of Agriculture and Project Finance for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC. And I'll let them take a minute and introduce themselves. Pat, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Pat Sheikh, and I'm the Agribusiness and Trade Director at CCA. I've been with CCA for about 3 years. I came from the U.S. government, the Foreign Agricultural Service of USDA, having spent more than 30 years at that organization covering global trade and development issues. And my last assignment was on Africa, trying to bring together trade and development for the continent, having worked in developed countries such as China and Japan, and also developing countries both in South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And so I'm happy to be on this webinar.
Bruce, could we have you?
Sure. This is Bruce Cameron. I've worked at OPIC for about 21 years. I'm a Director of Finance, otherwise known as a loan officer. I've worked on, I think, most of the sectors and most of the regions, and for the past 6 or 7 years have spent quite a bit of my efforts focusing on ag, food, forestry, aquaculture related projects, anywhere from smallholder farmer finance all the way up to large corporate investments, and including financial lending platforms, so any small and medium enterprises as well. So that's just a little bit about myself.
And our first question for you, Pat, is what is the importance of having a well-functioning agriculture and agribusiness system in Africa?
Well, I think it goes without question that Africa has vast tracts of land and water, and of course the continent is surrounded by oceans. And Africa, like other areas in the world, more than 60% of the population do live in rural areas. So it makes sense that they would look at agriculture as a sector that should be developed. Because of the large concentration of people on these agricultural lands, agriculture has a potential, if it is done correctly, to spur economic development. And if you look at most of the GDP rates across the continent, you'll find that agriculture contributes, if they're an agricultural producing country, at least 40% of total output comes from agriculture. So it's a huge factor in the gross domestic product in the country. So as I said, it makes a lot of sense because it's a natural base for Africa, and it is one that can help bring along other sectors. And it also relies on other sectors such as infrastructure and energy, and it can also bring about social change by bringing in more people, if it's done in a way that, like it's done here in the United States or in Europe, that it's used as a means to expand into the larger population, although you don't need as many people on the land because you would be using mechanization. I think in terms of the social issues, if the agricultural sector is done correctly, then Africa can feed itself, and it wouldn't have to rely on imports of food from other countries. And then it would also can take that surplus production and either use it internally for their own domestic population or export the surplus to neighboring countries or even globally, which some of them are doing right now. So to wrap up, agriculture, because it's such a huge player in the economy, has the greatest potential for poverty reduction and to reduce inequality.
Well, those are really powerful needs for effective agriculture in Africa. Thank you, Pat. What do you feel the factors, or what do you feel the main factors are impacting agriculture in Africa?
Well, first and foremost, I kind of hinted at this in the last question, but for agriculture to change in Africa, it has to be viewed first and foremost as a business. It's not a hobby. It's not something that, you know, we're just going to help these smallholder farmers. It's actually being dealt with as a business. So you look at it from the point of view of profit and loss, from the point of view of how do you employ technology, from the point of view of do you have the right access to the inputs that you need, like seeds and fertilizer? Are government policy and regulations in place that will support the agricultural sector so that a business person won't be stymied by a policy that doesn't make business sense in terms of the production of the commodity or the movement of that commodity from the production area to the processing and distribution areas? Also, I think that, you know, the sector needs to look at food safety concerns, not only for export markets but for their own people. There have been a number of instances where food safety issues have arisen in Africa, mainly in the grain sector with high aflatoxin levels. Agriculture is a very complicated business, and sometimes the requirements that are imposed on the country and the regional level don't necessarily correspond to the requirements on the global level. And so there has been an effort on the global scene to make sure that all of these requirements kind of sync up with each other, so there's not this issue of country versus regional versus global issues. And also developed countries need to harmonize their requirements so that Africa is not, doesn't have to, currently it does, but doesn't have to produce for one set of conditions for the United States as opposed to the European Union, for example. As I said, it's a complicated business. On the animal side, it can get very complicated, but the animal regulations are really there to ensure the safety of those animals and to ensure the safety of the food supply. And on the crop side, to make sure that these requirements are being met, again, for safety and export concerns, whether they're exports for the local market or for other markets. I do think that African farmers are disadvantaged because they don't have access to credit, they don't have insurance if there's a natural disaster. That has to be changed. Some countries are looking at that for smallholder farmers. They're experimenting with different kinds of models to help them. They need to know marketing and pricing information. Unfortunately, in Africa, oftentimes when the crop is finished as far as harvest, it all comes onto the market at one time, depressing prices. So there has to be a market consideration so that they don't have that situation. So if they're going to withhold some of the crops, then they also need to have adequate storage so that the crops are maintained in a safe and wholesome way. Post-harvest losses is a huge issue. I know the Rockefeller Foundation is heavily involved in this. We're talking about 30% on average of a crop that's being lost. So there are ways, and we know what to do in the developed world. We can help Africa in terms of this very, very critical issue. We need to bring science and technology in line with one another so that we take this agriculture into the 21st century. And we also need to make sure that we're not just growing crops because they can be grown, but that they take into account what is happening in the climate in these countries so that we position the country to be better off in terms of that issue.
Well, Pat, those are really great areas where we can have an impact. What solutions do you see for overcoming access to market issues?
Well, I think first and foremost that there's a lot of technical training that has to be done. Some of it will have to be done in conjunction with African governments or universities, but these smallholder farmers, they're people think that they're not very in sync with market conditions. They are, they just don't have the technical training. And I know that many nonprofit organizations are helping them with technical training. I've seen it firsthand with regard to bee production in Ethiopia, with regard to grain storage facilities in Nigeria. So if the training is given to them, and it doesn't have to be high-cost training, then these farmers will pick up on what it is that they need to do. And in that training, again, I can't emphasize enough that the product has to be handled safely, both for the domestic consumer and for markets. And a lot of times it's not understood. We're just learning in developed country markets that if you have animals close by to crop production, you really need to be careful with the runoff that comes from animal waste, because that can cause problems with regard to crop production. So, these things can be taught, and they're just, once a farmer knows, then he or she will take adequate steps to make sure that they're producing both animals and crop production safely. Farmers need to understand about supply and demand conditions. They need to understand what that means to bring a product to market. Are the roads adequate enough to bring that product to market? And what happens when there's a huge deluge of product just dumped onto the market or in the marketplace that's not really adequately set up to make sure that the product doesn't spoil, especially if it's a perishable commodity. And then farmers want to be reliable suppliers, but they have to have the tools and the inputs so that they can become reliable suppliers. No food chain operation in any country wants to be dependent on a farmer that he doesn't know if that farmer can supply these products that are in the grocery stores that they want to sell. And then I think that there has to be a way to organize these smallholder farmers. There are many attempts to do that. There's no one right way to do it. But if much of this agriculture in Africa is being done by smallholder farmers, then these farmers have to be organized in a way and in a manner that helps to ensure economies of scale so that they get the right pricing for their product. And finally, but not least, the packaging of these products is very, very important, especially if they want to market to developed countries, because consumers are a little bit more sophisticated in terms of what they want with regard to packaging. That doesn't take a lot of effort. But farmers just need to know what is their packaging looking like as opposed to packaging that comes from South Africa or the United States, for example.
Oh, those are great solutions, Pat. Thank you. Recently, there's been an increase in women in agriculture in Africa. Do you think this will be a trend that continues? And if so, how do you see that influencing the future of agribusiness in Africa?
Okay, so this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, women in agriculture, and I think it will continue. And I just think women, because they have families that they have to raise, are far more inclined to do the right thing in terms of agriculture. They're the main workers along with you in terms of agricultural output, and they are doing things right. They need to be taken seriously. I know there are areas, commodities that they're heavily involved in, like shea butter, and the shea butter products are coming here to the United States and other developed country markets. They're being used in cosmetics. They're even being used in chocolate production in Europe. So these are women farmers, and they're beginning to improve their standard of living so that they can take care of their kids and send them to school, which raises the standard of living for everyone. Where they're being held back in many cases is that they don't have, like men, access to credit or insurance. It's a very expensive proposition for the government anyway, but that has to be addressed. Women should be able to inherit land. They should be able to get insurance for their products, and they should be able to have a voice in these regulations that are being developed that affect them very directly.
That's a great perspective of women in agriculture. I'm grateful. You have a personal interest in that area, and I'm grateful for that perspective. I know CCA has been working a lot on building up agriculture, the agricultural sector in Africa. What are some ways that CCA can assist those working in this sector?
Okay, so CCA has a number of ag members and also related sectors that help to make agriculture viable, including infrastructure and energy, because without that you can't bring agriculture into the 21st century. So oftentimes we don't look in a myopic kind of view when we talk about agriculture here. We look at all of the other sectors that impact agricultural productivity. So because we have members across that wide spectrum of sectors, we are very good at providing access to folks in terms of what it really takes to have a viable agricultural sector. So we can provide that access. We can provide those connections to not only our members, but to those that want to become members or want to partner with our members. We have various working groups throughout the year on agriculture, and we also include technology in that discussion because, as I said in the beginning, we want to bring people into the 21st century, and that's critical. We don't want Africa to be a 20th century agricultural producer. We want to take Africa directly into the 21st century, and the computer and technology allows us to do that. And it also allows us to avoid some of the mistakes that developed countries have made in terms of technology. So I think Africa is well poised, the CCA is well poised to bring all these people together and to make it work across the various value chains in Africa. Another thing we do is we have trade missions to various countries, and we don't just look at the countries that are what I call the darlings of Africa. We also look at countries that show potential that people may not think they should go there, but there's great potential there. So we'll look across the board at the continent writ large and do a trade mission that makes sense, that opens people's eyes to the possibilities that they may not have thought of in terms of country trade missions. And take them there so they can see for themselves, and we can provide access to both government and business officials in these countries so that folks feel that they have gotten their money's worth, so to speak, when they go on these trade missions, and then they can follow up with the work that they need to do in terms of enacting that kind of a business, whatever it is that they're focusing on. And of course, if they need help, we can help them. And last but not least, one of the most important ways we can help folks is that through our summits that are held biannually, where we convene probably the largest number of U.S. and African government and business officials so that folks can meet and speak directly firsthand to people that are involved in this sector and can network and provide opportunities for for newcomers, what they can bring to the table and take it from there.
Pat, we had a question from the audience related to that. Does CCA only work with U.S. companies in Africa? And related to that, you only work with really large companies?
No, that's not really true. We have about 15% of our membership are African companies, and we'd like to see that grow. So if there's an African company that wants to join us, we would welcome that. We also have SMEs, and we also have nonprofits. So we have a wide variety because we know when I mentioned training, the people that usually do the training are the nonprofits. And we welcome the SMEs because we know that that's a growing sector in Africa and that we need to connect with those. Yes, they will go on our website and they will see large companies. I'm not going to deny that. But if they look closely, they'll also see small and medium-sized companies. And about 50% of our membership is comprised of small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's kind of a misnomer. I think they see the big names and they think that we're just representing the big guys. But we have the ability to look at large, medium, and small scale producers, and we'd like to do more in the SME area.
Great. Thank you, Pat. And well, Bruce, how is OPIC working to assist the agriculture sector doing business in Africa? Bruce, maybe we could have you review quickly again what you covered earlier on OPIC's work in assisting the agricultural sector in Africa.
So OPIC is working to support projects in various African countries. As I mentioned before, we work across a broad range of sectors, and even in what we refer to as agriculture, it's really agriculture production, forestry, aquaculture, as well as the processing and production and transportation, logistics that relate to agricultural activity, even food processing. And we're driven by where the investors want to go. So unlike other development agencies that pick a project to work on, we're really driven by where the private sector group, the companies that knock on our door, they come in and they say they have a particular project they ask us to finance, and we look at that particular business plan. And while we have to have some U.S. connection to the projects we support, many of the projects are majority foreign owned that we support. They just have some U.S. connection to them. And we like what Pat was saying about CCA, yes, we do work with large corporations, but we also work with many SMEs, and we work with quite a few not-for-profits on some interesting projects that really go to microfinance or smallholder farmer finance. And as I was mentioning, we're also part of the initiative, the Global Food Security Act initiative, that includes 11 other U.S. government agencies that are trying to bring a whole of government approach to food security projects.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Obviously, OPIC's making a huge difference in the agriculture area. What do you feel the U.S. priorities are when it comes to financing the agribusiness sector?
Well, and again, for us, we're driven by what say like a U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, they might decide on a particular project. There's a need in a particular part of a country, and they go and execute that project. OPIC's mission is really to allow the private sector to go find the opportunities they see as their best opportunities, and then we work to support that. So it really comes down to can it be a sustainable project from a financial standpoint? Now, I think what we've learned, similar to some other sectors, is many of the projects in the broad agriculture sector, particularly in Africa, probably are going to start more in the grant realm and probably transition into more of a for-profit mode. So what more and more seems to be happening, development banks and foundations and private sector entities are forming collaborations that recognize that it's really the left hand and right hand working together, that there's going to be some early part of the project or investment that's more grant or technical assistance oriented, but by building that foundation, that allows it to then move into the more of the commercial realm. And I would also say smallholder farmer finance is definitely, it's not the only piece of it, but it's a definite big part of the equation that we're all working on. And I'll touch on that in a moment.
Great. Well, thank you for your vision of priorities. Bruce, how do you see agricultural automation impacting farming in Africa? Obviously, it's a huge part in the U.S. and in Europe and other areas of the world, and how do you see it impacting Africa?
I definitely think it's part of the equation, and there are companies working on different initiatives right now. It does raise some issues, particularly the large-scale farming, because then that relates back to the large tracts of land and who has control or ownership, and making sure from a social and political standpoint that that's well handled so that you don't get adverse situations where people in a country feel like outside entities are coming up and land grabbing, taking up big blocks of land, and it's not really benefiting the host country community the way it should. So I know I'm sort of skewing towards land tenure, but that's the thing about automation. The two go hand in hand, because generally when you're automating, you're thinking in terms of scale and aggregation and bigger operations. So that those two issues have to be worked hand in hand. At the same time, even with smallholder farmers, automation through, and I guess I'm thinking more, while it may be mechanical automation, also through software, through the smartphones and the mobile information and mobile applications that are now available. That's going to be a huge part of the equation related to smallholders, to be able to aggregate them together into a more efficient supply and buying relationships. I think there's also, and this is just a personal observation, there's a balancing act in African agriculture, because on one hand, at the upper end of the scale, scaling projects, automation, efficiency, European, American, Asian technologies is definitely a huge part of the equation. And with the smallholders, as I mentioned, you bring, the ability to bring in mobile information technology, but at the same time, you have all these people that live in rural areas. They need jobs. They need to be uplifted and need opportunities. So I think there's also a balancing act there. If one were to go in and completely automate a rural area, so you have huge farms that are totally automated, I guess the question would be, what would happen to all the basic labor job opportunities, because you'd be doing it through a totally automated process. So I personally think there's many different situations, and it's going to be a balance of some automation and some basic labor solutions, and some mixing of the two, depending on which country, which part of the country. There isn't going to be just one size fits all.
Well, that's very fascinating. Thank you, Bruce. How are smallholder farmers being brought into the equation?
Well, and I was listening to Pat's comments, and just as an aside, it's really just it's one of the areas I've ended up spending a lot of my time on at OPIC, just because it comes up so often. Again, we're driven by private sector interests, but working in this arena, you can't help but be skewed into the smallholder conversation. So one of the things that OPIC's hosting on June 21st, we're hosting a gathering here of foundations, development banks, financial intermediaries, NGOs, not-for-profits, and technology companies, to specifically focus on how to bring financing and the other resources to smallholder farmers. And it really is the recognition, and the slides have touched on it, that it's really a package of research. You have to bring the ag extension or technology assistance, the financing, the supplier and buyer aggregation solutions, and then that whole mobile technology platform. They have to really be brought together as a package solution. And getting these multiple parties to cooperate together, perhaps not in a rigid way, but on a set of pilot projects, because there's many projects that are being done where one or two entities support it, and they're kind of one-off projects, rather than the community at large trying to say, hey, let's have some collaboration. And one of the real specific points, or the reason to have this gathering, is that's become very crystal clear to me as a lender, and it has been a missing ingredient, is if you can't map the farm fields, even with smallhold farmers, if you can't map the boundary of that farm or that field, there's no way we're going to bring scale across multiple countries and multiple lending portfolios of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of lending to smallhold farmers. And so this community that I've brought together all are looking at this issue. There are some small examples out there where mobile phones are being used to do this, or satellite technology, but it's just not being widely done. And it also goes back to the issue of land tenure. It's a way to recognize, okay, in some places you're just not going to have formalized land title or land boundaries, but that doesn't mean that you don't actually, from an operational standpoint, have valid boundaries that the farmers and local communities work with on a year-to-year basis. And from a lender's perspective, if you can start to capture that, then year over year, being able to compare that to other layers of information, you can start to make better assessments about how to reduce loss, how to bring in, Pat touched on weather or crop insurance can now be much more applicable. Aggregation of supply and buying relationships can be much more efficient. Even political relationships, if I can now start to map that my bad borrowers all associate to a particular local village leader, which I might not have been able to see before if I don't have the fields mapped. Now I can go have a conversation with that local village leader and say, look, you know, my 10% of bad borrowers are all clustered right around your geographic area. Clearly there's some correlation. Or I can start to see that it may relate to the part of the land they're in. They may be in the bottom land that just is really bad land, but again, unless it's really mapped out, it's hard to see that. So it's a very small, in one sense it's a very small thing, but it may be something that starts to allow the scale and speed of the solution to be brought as far as support to smallholder farmers.
Those are great insights for a pervasive question, and so thank you so much, Bruce. What would be the most helpful advice that you could give to someone looking to finance an agricultural endeavor in Africa?
Well, particularly if it's an investment-oriented project, you know, and this is true. What I'm about to say sounds so easy and pat. It's true in any other sector, particularly in this broad sector. But it really comes down to having a management and ownership team that has experience in the type of project or business that they want to execute. I mean, all the better if they have experience in that country and it's an expansion of an existing operation, or they at least have experience in that country in a similar operation, or they have experience in that region of Africa. But it's a real detriment when you get a team, a management team, an ownership team who either they haven't worked abroad or they've worked in, you know, maybe South America but not in African countries, or they're not properly bound into the project. You know, okay, you've got a management team, but the person with the real expertise is a consultant who's not a permanent member of the management team or doesn't have the proper, excuse me, financial incentives to be locked into the project on a long-term basis. And, you know, that ability within the team, the management team and the ownership team, and it may be one and the same or it may be two layers there, to have the second and third level checking. Hey, I'm the CEO, there's two people that check what I do. There's a CFO, there's two people that check what they do. There's a chief operating officer, so there's a check and balance system, and part of it's human and part of it's through software and part of it's through observation. It's so core and foundational to these type of projects. It's probably 85% of it from a financier's perspective. If somebody walks in the door and they have that type of team, they're going to have a much better chance of being successful. If they come in and they've never worked in the country, or I don't know, maybe they've run hotels and all of a sudden now they want to run a farming operation, or they've run an advertising business and now they want to run a milk production operation. It's almost doomed to fail right from the beginning. And because the other thing that comes along with that experience is understanding the social and political and cultural norms within a country, and that's such a big part of the equation too. If you come as an outsider and you don't have that experience, that's just a huge learning curve and leaves you wide open for, I'm not sure what a nice way to say it, it's just a lot of problems, and I'm sure Pat can talk about those as it just, but that would be my biggest thing is, you know, to be able to bring that part of a team, and if it takes a little longer to put it together, okay, well then it takes a little longer to put the deal. And I guess the last thing I would say is, as an investor team is looking at an opportunity, to make a rational decision. That sometimes people get so in love with their project, it's hard for them to let go. And I think investors always need to be able to say to themselves, okay, we invested $50,000, we invested $100,000, we invested $300,000, but in our heart of hearts we know it's better to let that go and walk away than risk losing $2 million or $5 million going forward, because we just know after all the work we put into it's not going to work. And those aren't easy decisions, but I think it's also part of the mentality one has to have trying to do agriculture-related projects in many of the African countries.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, and thank both of you for your insights into African agriculture in the 21st century. And we'd now like to open it up for questions from the audience. And our first question is, my question goes to Patricia and Cameron. How can CCA and OPIC support the scaling up of viable solutions or business models that utilize proven technologies in addressing key food safety issues such as aflatoxin contamination in Africa?
Do you want me to go first, Bruce?
That'd be great.
Please.
Okay, yeah, I don't think it's just CCA and OPIC, but I mean we can do our part. I think that that USDA with their Agricultural Research Service, I know that they sent their scientists to Kenya because people were, I was there at USDA and so I approved this, people were dying from the high aflatoxin levels, and animals were dying because you can die from that. So I think that what CCA can do is when you have an issue like aflatoxin, the question that was asked, that we can make sure you get the right people in your country that can address this problem. This is a science and a scientific issue. It's one that researchers are very familiar with here. It's one that requires a solution that is very simple. And what we did at USDA is we introduced what they call good aflatoxin levels into the soil, so that from the very beginning when that crop was planted, the bad aflatoxin didn't have a chance to develop. But we had to have protocols with the Animal Health Inspection Service in Kenya, and then when the crop was harvested, we made sure that the storage conditions were correct, because you can get aflatoxin a second time if you don't have proper storage. So I think that what CCA can do is CCA and OPIC, we can put you in the right direction of whatever the issue is, who has the best expertise that can address a particular issue that you've raised. And maybe sometimes it might be our members, but in this case it really is an issue that scientists have dealt with, because we have it here. We just don't have it in high levels like they do in Africa.
My next question is, President Adesina focused on agribusiness during his remarks at the African Development Bank meeting this week. Are there plans for OPIC to ramp up support for agribusiness? Are there particular types of investment projects that OPIC focuses on, i.e. insurance or direct financing for projects?
I haven't. Oh, go ahead.
Bruce?
I think, as I mentioned, we're driven by where the private sector wants to go. So right now, and we're part of the Global Food Security Act team. So I think we're wide open to support projects in the ag food sector. If sponsors knock on our door and they've got a good business plan, then we're going to try to do that project. So I think it's, as we can find good projects, we will try to support them, and if we can grow our portfolio, we will. And through this experimental process with the other agencies where we're trying to develop a more efficient way for all of us to come together and have unified the U.S. government agencies, unified conversations around the same specific investment opportunity. And again, this is just beginning. It's just the learning stage we're in. But that's one of the things we're trying to do. And Pat was, these projects that come up, you don't quite know where they fit or which agency should lead. But if it's investment oriented, we're trying to find a way to do that. So I would say yes, we are. Part of it for OPIC is we're waiting for permanent political leadership, and also we're waiting to see over the next few months how things shake out between the executive branch and Congress as far as what direction we'll go in fiscal year 18.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful. For Pat and then Bruce, how do you support agro exports into the U.S.?
We have several companies that import product from abroad. As a matter of fact, we have a Nigerian member who's importing agricultural products from Africa and doing quite well out of California. Fayus is the name of the company. So we're all for that. We believe in two-way trade, and there are products. There's a huge African population here in the United States that want these products, and then Americans tend to be very experimental and willing to try different things, so they want these products. And so we're all for products coming this way, and if businesses want our help in terms of getting those exports to our country, then we can certainly advise them on who they need to see, depending on what U.S. government agency has responsibility for that particular product. It can get complicated because sometimes it's the Food and Drug Administration, sometimes it's USDA, sometimes it's both. And then they need an importer on this side. For example, Namibia has been approved, the country, to export its beef to the United States, and that's just half the battle. Now they have to find a U.S. importer, and so we've been working with Namibia to help them find a viable U.S. importer to import that product into this country.
And for OPIC, we try to support projects where we can. If they have product coming into the U.S., particularly in the agriculture arena, our economists have to do not a special check, but a very thorough check to be sure that when the commodities come into the U.S., that they're not displacing U.S. product / U.S. jobs. So a lot of times there are crops that are grown counter-cyclical to the U.S. crop growing, or things that just aren't grown in the U.S. So we've actually been able to find quite a few agriculture types of projects that we're able to clear, but the big catch for us is we can't create any U.S. job loss from the projects we support.
And Bruce, there's a couple of questions that are related that I'll give you both of them. How would agriculture products like nuts and vegetables benefit from OPIC initiatives, especially for both buyers and suppliers to the U.S.? And would OPIC's initiatives support oil, palm, and groundnut, cashew, and livestock for export to the U.S., and how would this happen?
Well, we're a lender, right? We're going to lend to support a business operation. And from a policy standpoint, the things we have to consider are environmental standards, labor standards, U.S. economic impact, and human rights. And so we have a separate set of policy staff that look at each of those categories. So sometimes with projects, we tend to use the World Bank IFC environmental standards on projects, and typically many of our labor standards align there as well, things like child labor. So that's part of the equation, particularly in the agriculture arena, we have to look at. And as I mentioned, we have to be sure that whatever product is coming into the U.S. is not fundamentally causing U.S. job loss. But if they can pass those threshold tests, then it just becomes a credit analysis. Does the business make sense? Can it repay an OPIC loan? Does it cause good economic impact in the local country?
Next question. Europe and Asia are having a big impact in the agricultural area. Could you share your thoughts on that impact, and is there ever any collaboration with organizations in those regions? Pat, maybe?
That's a very good question. We do collaborate. Probably, it depends on what you say, Asia. I'm assuming that probably means China. Maybe it's other countries in Asia. I know Japan is, everybody's actually on the continent. We do collaborate at times. It's probably the more of our collaboration efforts with the European Union, but at times, you know, they tend to do what they need to do because they have their own kind of bilateral and regional agreements with Africa. But there is some collaboration. There could be more. With China, I would say there isn't. With Japan, there's been some. But obviously, Africa would benefit if we had more collaboration among the developed countries. That's my personal opinion. But sometimes we have different ways of doing business, especially when it comes to China and maybe India, as opposed to the way we do business. And sometimes our laws don't allow us to collaborate because we can't. They're not as sometimes our transparency regulations are much more stringent. But if the transparency issues can be dealt with, then there should be more collaboration.
And this is Bruce. I have been recently talking with a fair number of the European development banks, but one thing, and I've mentioned, OPIC has to have U.S. private sector connections to the projects we support. So that's always the mantra that either OPIC or myself working as an OPIC person keep in mind when I'm having those conversations. We definitely want to collaborate and work with others, and as I said, many times the investment projects we support have multiple investors from other countries in them, but it's always from that U.S. perspective of how does this help the U.S. company, how does it help the U.S. economy. If that part of it works, then yes, we're happy to collaborate.
And the next question for Pat and then for Bruce is, how does power affect the success of agriculture as a business in Africa, and how dependent is it on power?
Oh, absolutely. And when you can't do anything without power. If you're running, if you're trying to keep perishable products in a wholesome way, you have to have power. So power runs across this whole spectrum, and it doesn't have to be, you know, traditional forms of power like oil and gas, generated by oil and gas. It could be solar power, but there's no way that you're going to develop a modern agricultural system without power.
I would just second what Pat said. Absolutely, you need power.
And the last question for both of you is, to what extent is the legal framework that, for instance, governs warehousing of crops and land transaction an obstacle to investment? Pat?
It's a huge obstacle because we've got to get countries to agree. I know there's been a lot of work in the international arena to try to get, especially the land issues. The warehousing issues, that's an individual country decision. We've done agriculture. I know USDA has done some work on, like I said, in the warehousing with Nigeria and other countries, but it would certainly make things run a lot more smoother if those two issues were dealt with in a way that was beneficial for the agribusiness community at large.
And I would just add, and I'm gearing this comment back to the smallholder part of the equation. So I've touched on this idea of being able to map the fields. I think it's one where, as Americans, it's like changing the order we think of things. What mobile technology can allow us working with partners in the countries to do is map the fields first and build financial solutions from there and other service solutions that the smallholders need, which could eventually lead to more formal land titling and registration. But rather than initially trying to do something that's in one sense culturally different in the rural areas and just socially, culturally, legalistically very different and solve that, there's a way to sort of shortcut and get there through technology that allows some other more practical daily living things to happen, right? It allows support to be gotten to the smallholder first and make them more viable borrowers and business people, with the potential that that information that's gained potentially could be used to help them, the countries, build their formal land registration system later. So it's thinking of a way to take this order sequence of our usual thinking about this and reverse it a little bit. So that's my comment.
Well, thank you, and thank you both for your wonderful panelists today, and did a tremendous job, and we're grateful to have been able to share this webinar with you today. And we thank you both. We would like to remind everyone of the U.S.-Africa Summit, which is June 13th and 16th with Corporate Council on Africa. They have a tremendous program there, and attendance from all over the world, and especially from Africa, and tremendous support, and we encourage that opportunity. And then we also want to remind you on the upcoming webinar, Safer Entry Point, Botswana, with Ambassador John David Newman, and June 21st at 12 p.m. Eastern. And thank you each for attending today, and we're so grateful to have had this presentation. Thank you so much for helping us make this a special presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.